Welcome, everybody. First, I'm glad to report that this is the venue for my honors course in labor economics. So, I'll save you from the lecture that I would have had on a Monday in this venue, but instead do something far more interesting, as you know. So when I look back at the period we've gone through under the Zuma administration, I was trying to find a sort of pithy way of representing, perhaps trivializing to some extent, and you'll see why, what we've gone through. I realized that News 24 ran an article, which they do every year, on the word of the year. I don't know if you've seen this. So the nice catchy way of presenting this is word of the year. And in fact, in 2017, the word of the year, which is really a phrase, was state capture. And so I dug a little bit more, and I thought, oh, well, is that just sort of media bias or whatever? And it turns out that the word or the phrase was used 20,231 times in 2017. And it spanned across 11,000 media outlets or newspapers and so on. So in many ways, it was quite a strong representation of what we've lived through. Not just in 2017, but I think at its height in 2017. And just very quickly, I literally went through 6 or 7, if you like, responses in a more, dare I say, sort of research academic type environment to sense whether that word count reflects what or how we responded as a society. And of course, there were a couple of things. One was the release in inverted commas of the Gupta email, so to speak. So the presence of the Gupta leaks was a really important indicator for what we'd gone through in 2017. Associated with that was extensive and very high quality media coverage of state capture by Daily Maverick and Amabungani in particular, but followed by others. Third was the state capture report by the public protector at the time, right? A real high point of almost the contestation within government in terms of state capture. Fourth was the academics' portrayal of the promise report, right? Fifthly was the response from the church leaders in the form of the unburdening panels. And then 6 and 7, which are really important, less, if you like, written down responses, but more policy actions, was the response from civil society in terms of protest action, which was something we'd never seen since the apartheid years. And then finally, the leadership within the ANC actually fighting back. And that collection, if you like, led to what we saw in December 2017. This is sort of the background in terms of what we lived through as a society, but what was at least important to us analytically, the group of us working on trying to understand the economics of corruption better, was to try and figure out, because we're not the first country that's gone through this, right? We're not the only country that will go through this, is to try and understand what's been happening globally and what historically has occurred globally with respect to institutionalized corruption, petty corruption, and state capture. And there is no better person, right, than the originator or one half of the pair who originated the phrase state capture, and that's Daniel Kaufmann. So just a little bit more formally, Daniel he's president and CEO of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, based in Washington, D.C., but also with an office in New York. He was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, which is the world's leading public policy institute. Was the director of the World Bank Institute. Some of you may remember the World Bank Institute on the teaching side. And his core training, though, is as an economist. And he worked for many, many years in the World Bank. And he may tell us stories of this, but the phrase state capture was coined in his early work in the Soviet Union, when you realize that the laws and regulations were being panel beaten to serve an elite, and hence the phrase state capture. But he goes on then to work at the OECD and the IADB, where he serves on very high-level advisory panels for both those organizations. Daniel has a PhD in economics from Harvard University, and in case you're confused by the accent, he's actually Chilean, right? And last night, so I'm going to let the cat out of the bag, he told us about, and maybe he can tell you in more detail, about a 6-hour meeting he had with Fidel Castro with respect to corruption, and why Fidel Castro was very supportive of what he had to say. But that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Daniel, and he'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions and answers. Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, Haroon. Good morning to you all. It's really my pleasure and honor to be with you today, and I'm a bit humbled by your introduction. Very important that you mentioned, in this case, one of my key collaborators, Prof Haroon. Throughout my career, that has been very important of my approach in order not to make a difference to partnerships. Virtually everything I have is co-author. The same applies, by the way, which I'm going to show in a second, to the worldwide governance indicators, which we started over 20 years ago with my collaborator at the World Bank, then our credit is still at the World Bank. In a few hours, in fact, when the morning starts in Washington, this will up on the web, the new data. I'll get into that, but it's just to illustrate that point. You also let the cat out of the bag that my training is in economics. I'm sorry about that, but at the same time, I'm very proud because, yes, I was a traditional economist, and with the experience in the former Soviet Union that was transformative for me to understand that that wasn't enough. Just to understand and to research traditional economics was not going to make the difference in these countries in transition. It had to be coupled with political, more way into not only political economy, but into politics, understanding the issue of corruption and governance. And that quest for integration and for evidence-based integration that has driven much would have that requirement. So the evidence-based approach to measurement, to assessment, analysis, to policy advice and policy making we have considered crucial throughout this work, and that's what's going to drive this presentation. I led quite a bit, and it's going to be going very fast through slides. I promise anybody who's interested, we all available afterwards, but apologies in advance if I don't do justice to every issue, but I want to show you the evidence. Let the data do a bit of the talking, and then we'll get, and I look very much forward to the interactive part of the discussion. So without further ado, just as a quick outline, I already gave a preview of where I come from, empirics, the power of data, and of diagnostic tools, which are empirically based and, of course, conceptually based too. In terms of governance, and I will get to the issue of state capture, but I think it's so important to put it in a broader context that I will go through some of the materials that we have worked over time regarding governance more generally. And we started with a challenge to the field, and that's where it was useful. I come from economics and statistics, which I've also done, and with my partner in crime, Art Cray, who is a brilliant statistician, among other things, we sought to challenge the notion that many of these issues, and particularly governance, were not subject to measurement. And we will see that how we did it very quickly and why it matters. And then we start discussing the issues of corruption, and then get into the more specific of what could be a game changer in a country. It's not just a regular type of corruption, but state capture. We think that there could be their legal and illegal aspects. I will have only a little bit of time because I don't want to cut too much from the discussion, but if the discussion comes up, I told her I'm prepared to also address particular issues in one sector, which my organization focuses in particular right now, which is governance, misgovernance, corruption, and state capture in the extractive sector, particularly we deal with oil, gas, and mining. So the resource-dependent countries are particularly vulnerable in that context. And then we got the implications and the discussion. So without further ado, starting at the broad level, what are we talking about when we talk about governance? And we felt very much that there was so often vaguely just discussed and in very general terms, so we thought it was very important to put out there, we're talking mid-90s, mid-late 90s, a definition. We did not reinvent the wheel to come out from scratch. There are writings dating back to 400 BC, which are very interesting. The Ashtar Shastra in India, by Kautilya, the advisor to the king and so on. That's very useful. But then there are many other modern writings. We just try to synthesize in the simplest possible terms from the literature, and we just offer the basic definition of governance, seeing governance as a set of traditions and institutions by which authority in a country is exercised. Because that is very simple, very brief. The important thing is when one starts unpackaging. Okay, so what does it mean more concretely in practice? So we unbundled it into three different key clusters of governance. The political cluster, the economic cluster of governance, and the institutional respect cluster of governance. Because our main quest was to try in a conceptually and statistically rigorous way build a set of indicators, of measures for governance for the whole world, we sought to try to unbundle each one of these clusters into simple measurable indicators. And we start with the first cluster, which is a political cluster, which is a process by which those in authority are selected and monitored, right? Monitored, held accountable, and replaced. And that we converted it basically into two indicators that were to be measured. One is the extent to which a country enjoys or doesn't voice and democratic accountability, and second, the extent to which the country enjoys political stability and absence of major violence and terrorism. Very different dimensions. So to begin putting in the context that we can discuss the political aspects of governance, but it cannot all be put into just one measure. Those are very different ones. So those are the first two indicators. Then we move to the second cluster for the second set of a pair of indicators, and that's the more economic aspect. So the capacity of government to formulate and implement policies, and also to provide public services to the population. Again, two measurable indicators. One is the extent to which the government functions well or not, government effectiveness, bureaucracy, and civil service, and so on. And the second, which is a very different function of government, is the quality of the regulatory effect. Last but not least is the institutional dimension of governance, the respect of citizens and state for the institutions that govern interactions among them. Again, when bundled into two measurable indicators, the extent to which there is an effective application of rule of law. We do not rely on data that just suggests whether things are in the books or not, but whether they're implemented and enforced. So the extent that the rule of law really functions in a country or not. And last but not least, the sixth indicator, second and the institutions, is the extent to which there is control of corruption or not in the country. One rationale for putting this simple framework in this context was to begin having a much more concrete discussion about governance. I would go to conferences, the international anti-corruption conferences that Transparency International hosts government does every 2 years. Haroon is going now to Copenhagen for the next one in a few weeks. He's organizing a very interesting seminar just prior to that. Every 2 years we would go. If I would ask in the early days about what, in your view, is governance to that group, is the absence of corruption. I would go to the International Bar Association conference, and with us, which is good rule of law. So depending basically on our own background, for the economists, and particularly many of the world bankers and many of the ministers of finance, was the second cluster, the government effectiveness, is how governments function well. So it was very important for us to make the distinction between good government and good governance. On the one hand, much more broader, the latter, between rule of law, governance, and corruption. They're all extremely important but distinct dimensions of governance. Second, since many of us were very interested in the quest to understand better what can be done for controlling corruption, as I would say from early on, one doesn't fight corruption by fighting corruption. It was clear early on that just creating another anti-corruption commission in a country, or having another agency for ethics, having even another law for anti-corruption. Most of the world has a law in the books for anti-corruption. Another anti-corruption campaign. Russia is in its 18th now. That was not going to make the difference. Instead, it was much harder work of looking at all the systems of government institutions across the spectrum, and there was therefore no escape. If one wanted to only focus on control of corruption, looking what's happening with rule of law, what's happening with voice and accountability in the country. So that provided a sense that any analysis, and if we were going to measure it, then one had to look at the data and at the evolution on these other dimensions. Enough about the conceptual part, just to say, trust me essentially, and everything is in the web in terms of the sources. We provided a framework, the methodology in terms of how to aggregate all these sources of data that were totally disparate and disorganized and with many gaps, which we collected, and we provided a methodology of aggregation, statistically, robust methodology called an observed component model, and by now there are over 30 such sources which we aggregate. As researchers, analysts, by doing this, by providing this, we felt very strongly we do not make anybody judgment. So we do not a single of these indicators has a value from us. A total wall between the analyst who puts it together and the source of data and assessment. So we can be criticized by the methodology, but ultimately, what we're talking about the statistical aggregation of an extremely varied set of sources that come from cross-country surveys of firms, whether the World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Surveys or a number of others like that, surveys of individuals, like Gallup, Transparency International Global Corruption Barometer, Latino Afrobarometer, and so on, expert assessment for commercial risk rating agencies, and you see the list there. I'm not going to bore you with that. From NGOs and think tanks, and from governments and multilateral institutions. Many of them return. Headquarters, locations of these type of sources, organizations, and so on is throughout the world. Respondents are in the countries themselves, whether it's individuals, the citizens, or the firms, and so on. I say that all that because often there's a perception that this person who comes from abroad, from the north, just decided and has this. This is basically what hundreds of thousands of respondents from the countries themselves are saying. Of course, it's an element of judgment on what they're responding. But the fact that it's an aggregation of hundreds of thousands of them, at the end of the day, at the very least, we say, well, those views must matter in whether they vote with their feet or not, how they vote in the polls, how the firms invest or don't invest. Going quickly now to the start to talk about the data. So it's 200 plus countries from 1996 until the end of 2007. As of later today, I'm showing the data mostly for until the end of 2016 because it hasn't gone live yet, but it hasn't changed much. There's no space in one slide to put 200 some countries, so there are about 50. Two noteworthy points I'd like to make in terms of the data, the bad news and the good news. So first, we felt very strongly that we needed to be very transparent and precise about the extent of imprecision in any of these exercises. And that was not the norm. It's not just about ours, but any source of data, whether it's about governance, investment climate, even, if I may say so, official statistics is subject to margins of error, whether the measurement level, whether it's a judgment, and so on. The statistical methodology we use to do this exercise and to do this aggregation is complex. So it doesn't have the advantage of simplicity. But one big advantage it has, it allows the data itself to provide an estimate of the margins of error, how accurate or inaccurate the estimate is for each country and for each dimension. So what we see here, the height of each column is essentially the level of governance for that country. It's the rating is because it's in statistical dispersion terms from minus 2.5 to plus 2.5, but that's the height of the column. But the thin line atop each column is the margin of error. The sober news is that one ought not. One has to be very careful in interpreting any of these data. One ought not run the horse races and pretend that I beat my neighbor by a nose. Between New Zealand, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden, it's a statistical tie. Doesn't make one first and second or third. And the same applies for any group where you're clearly bundled together. The good news is that by doing this aggregation, using so much data, that margin of error is not fatally flawed, that you cannot use it, that you cannot make inferences. In fact, that's one of the reasons with some degree of confidence, and we test that statistically, one can basically group the countries into about 5 or 6 meaningful categories, and those are different in the statistically meaningful sense. So the countries in green are different than the countries in yellow, and those in turn are different than those in red, and particularly dark red who are in governance crisis. A completely different way of looking at it, but it's the same data, and to begin seeing how the world looks like is in terms of a governance map. And right now, this was an accountability to show one. If it looks to you a little bit like a copy and paste from the web, it is. It's on the web, and you can produce it and ask for in any form that you're interested. Already, what begins this political stability as an observer, what begins to emerge from looking at it in this way, first, well, they are correlated. They're not the same. Different countries perform differently and quite differently in different dimensions. If we look at voice and accountability between China, Russia, Federation, and so on, it's one very different picture than when one gets into the government effectiveness one, where you see China is already better than the middle of the pack and so on. So there are countries where there are enormous differences between one dimension and the other. Obviously, the overall correlation is high. The other noteworthy point is the incredible variation across countries, which made it neighbors, and certainly within a continent. Well, Africa, obviously, there is quite a variation. My own Latin American from Chile, as was said, and I cannot help say, it's a whole spectrum between the Venezuela and compete, right? We know which way. Not in my own country, Chile. It's quite green, basically. Every dimension of which it's seen in rule of law, control of corruption. In fact, we do see in Africa, it's a whole spectrum between red and green, although unfortunately it's quite a bit in the middle of red. That's the zooming part, because I cannot help but show even though we still have a significant challenge. But also I cannot help indicating that it's not just the whole north that's really well by definition, because it's a rich countries, even between Canada and the United States. One is dark green, the other is not so green, and you can imagine which one. The same applies across almost every dimension. In Europe itself, if one, let's see, yeah, In Europe itself, it's enormous also variation between the northern countries, and one gets to Italy or Greece, it's a very different picture. Similarly, voice and accountability, especially what's happening now, like in Hungary, Poland, and so on, it's very, very mixed, very varied. That also, these are copy and paste for the web, but one can ask if you're interested as an analyst or writing a paper. Okay, I just want to look at my own country and how we have done over time. The same applies. Very small differences over time ought not to be overinterpreted. But if it starts exceeding the margins of error, one can see, and it has happened in about 1/3 of the sample, very significant changes over the past 20 years of which we have data. We're about 1/3 or more of the country. Unfortunately, it's involved the case of Colombia is emblematic of a country having in many dimensions made very significant progress. And most recently, it's not reflected here, the peace accords, and probably yes, there is an additional kick for this. Look carefully at this picture. Second, how would the mirror image of exactly the opposite look like? Well, it's its name. Like Venezuela. So countries with the same social, cultural, colonial, linguistic background, you name it, different directions. So anybody who claims that they say historically predetermined, not so. And we have seen in Chile, Argentina, the two Koreas and other emblematic cases and so on. But usually Venezuela, exactly. So there is nothing historically predetermined, let alone genetic theories or so on regarding this issue. Brazil is a more complicated case in both directions, not great, could be doing better. We do see the recent corruption, that what has happened there with Lavajato reflected, but there has been a strengthening in rule of law, which is very important and bodes well for the next stage, and that's one of the reasons all this has been exposed. Similarly, voice and accountability, it may be of high relevance what's happening in Brazil for anybody you I know you're so interested in here. I said I would not be able to help but show Chile. Chile is a case in general of very high level, between the 19th and the 95th percentile, the worst between the top 15 and top 25. But we have had our own hiccups, including on corruption as a result, and we'll discuss later. There have been many measures recently taken. But we see that it's an emerging economy and it's possible to overall have very high levels of governance without having achieved the status of being a very rich industrial country. Other parts of the world, progress, again, from very low base, countries like Indonesia, Ukraine on the side going in the right direction, Russia, wars, even Tanzania. Here, South Africa in the same context. You would know it better and you may have comments regarding that, but obviously it very clearly shows one of the areas of one of the windows for major progress of the future is the extent to which there is nowadays voice and democratic accountability. And rule of law has not been extremely high, but has not deteriorated according to data, which is another potential source when one looks at what could be points of entry that could help. This is all until the end of 2016. You are the very first, I'm showing, considered an official, because in a few hours it will be up and running, so I put it from an Excel and put it, how does it look now? The deterioration and control of corruption until from 2016 to 2017 continues, which may not surprise you until 2017. So that we do see from 2000, these are all what I've shown so far, including these. The top bar is 2000, then it's 2009, and then it's 2017. You can pick and choose from the web which period you have, but I thought that could be useful. So one sees a sense of what the data is saying there. Another cut is to look across countries for for one particular indicator. In this case, it's control of corruption. Again, you can see where in South Africa you have had an increasing challenge according to the data, but starting from a high base, so it's not that you relatively speaking. So it's not in the same type that many other countries, and also very different than what's happening in Venezuela or Russia. Conversely, one sees the promise there. I mean, what countries have done, like Georgia, enormous, important reforms have borne fruit. You may say, okay, kind of interesting, so maybe it can be measured and with caution and margins of error, but does it matter? How much does this matter? And that's another strand of work we have been involved in, and other academics as well. The bottom line, I'll be brief on this, yes, it matters and enormously so. This is a very simple depiction of how much it matters in terms of economic well-being in a country. If we put all the data together for all these 200 countries with our credit, we did this about 10 years ago, and we asked the question, okay, is it just a correlation between good governance, and in this case control of corruption, and income per capita, or are there causality, there's an important causality direction which goes perhaps, well, if you have higher income, it's a luxury good, one can then afford having better institutional governance, one can buy these as development progresses, or is it the other way around? That no, the only way of having high income per capita, it is through having improvement in governance. That's the causality direction, but not the other. It is the latter. It is causally so. A country that embarks in reforms to control corruption, to address state capture, address other governance dimensions, in the long run, you can expect having an income per capita which is 3 times higher. So basically, we call it the tripling of the dividend of improved governance and controlling corruption and state capture. In other words, $10,000 per capita today, the country can reach, not overnight, $30,000 per capita in real terms, in the same real terms in the future. Now, that improvement, we were very conservative. It's very realistic improvement that can be achieved. We're not talking about the whole spectrum, but moving from Equatorial Guinea to Norway. That's totally unrealistic. It cannot happen. That's 5 standard deviations in statistical terms, so that's a normal distribution. That's 5 standard deviations. We're talking about an improvement of 1 standard deviation, just traversing the distance of 1/5 from the worst to the next. The type of thing that we, frankly, have done in Chile, what has been done in the South Korea and many other countries, and we have seen that changing a generation. We have definitely tripling and then some the income per capita in some of these countries. So it matters, and it matters significantly, enormously, as it is the direction from improved government, less state capture, to higher income per capita. Not only that, 2/3 decrease in terms of infant mortality, and a significant improvement in education, particularly a reduction or elimination of illiteracy. That research we have done. Others have done the research showing the important, very significant pickup in terms of investment, both domestic and foreign investment. Others have done the links with strengthening of democratic institutions, and also the link with increased better national security. Not having capture and corruption in one's intelligence services makes a huge difference. But also more generally, because of the socioeconomic impact, then in terms of issues of migration, violence, terrorism, there are clear links. So it's across the spectrum that one can demonstrate that nowadays with data that it matters, and it matters enormously. This is just to show one dimension that I just didn't mention, how important it is nowadays to perform well and improve in these matters were being globally competitive. So this is just looking at our control of corruption scores and how much does it matter for the ranking in the world according to the World Economic Forum in terms of global competitiveness. We're talking about a correlation of over 0.2, which is enormous. Very, very similar in terms of how much the taxpayer at the end ends up losing in a country because the Treasury wants to issue international funds to attract basic funding for the country. On average, I call it the 1,000 basis points dividend of improved governance. On average, if one were to move from the quality of governance or control of corruption of a country like Egypt, which is not happening, to a country like mine in Chile, the difference is 1,000 basic points in terms of what the government bonds need to offer to attract foreign investment. That's 10 percentage points of the offer. On average, about 4 percentage points is what we need to do in Chile. Bond offer 14% in Egypt. This is a couple of years ago. Now it may change a little bit today, but it's just to suggest this has a major impact today. Similarly, when the Greek financial crisis ensues, I looked at these issues just for OECD countries, for the richer industrialized countries. This enormous variation among the rich industrialized countries, and even among those countries, it makes a huge difference what kind of budget deficit the country is. In terms of basic macroeconomic stability, we found that a country that had more corruption, difference just one standard deviation, not 5, one standard deviation. On average, we have 6 percentage point higher fiscal deficit than a country that was performing better. And we saw it also, and I unbundled the reasons why that corruption led to a fiscal deficit. So it has an enormous macroeconomic implication. So that, and there are other aspects which I'm not showing the data for the rest, because for the sake of time, it's important to have a bit of discussion of the homework that has been done, and we have done some, others have done much more too, on, okay, but what works? What is behind this corruption and we get to state capture? And one of the key correlates that appears again and again, and we see it in practice when we work on these issues, is the extent to which there is open voice, democratic accountability, freedom of the press, freedom of association, and civic space for NGOs to operate. It's incredibly important in terms of the issues we discuss. We see it in this form, we see it here too. And not only these press and voice freedoms, but more generally the extent in which transparency has become part of the DNA of the public institutions, the private sector, and also the NGO and other sectors. So all these issues, and we see it here, matters enormously in terms of the issues of controlling corruption and so on. The problem is that on these very important dimensions, the world has not progressed, unfortunately. There was a major transition to democracy between the 80s and the 90s, in part because of what happened in the Soviet Union, those were many countries, but also in my own country, in Latin America, moving away from military governments and so on. Since then, it has been quite stable in terms of formal democratic countries, in terms of holding or not holding elections and so on. But when one looks beyond that data, one sees that there have been increasing clouds in the horizon and movement away from this democratic movement in many countries. Even in freedom of the press, it's become, if anything, more restricted over the past 15 years. And I haven't put it the last year and a half, which has become more dire in a number of countries, and the picture is even dire. So less than 1/3 of the country of the world has a fully free press, which is incredible. So in this context, we also come to realize that one cannot say corruption is corruption is corruption. There are very different manifestations, and some may be particularly insidious and costly and have the particularity and a political dynamic of their own. And that's when we start looking much more into the distinction between the more traditional forms of corruption that everybody has been studying in the field, which one way of encapsulating what was administrative corruption versus what we call state corruption. In a nutshell, so that's where we started, and already Haroon gave some sense of that, so I'm not going to go through all the details. I hope I assume will come in the discussion, but just in a nutshell, to put it in very simple terms. Administrative corruption we always felt was usually associated with the traditional definition of corruption, the abuse of public office for private gain by essentially the public official accepting a bribe or a particular favor in a particular way in order to distort the implementation of a rule, a law, a regulation, or a policy. Very distinct from the much more insidious type of corruption which we observed in the early days of the post-Soviet era, particularly in Russia and Ukraine, which was essentially shaping those few in the elite which were shaping the laws, the regulations, the policies, and also capturing the whole procurement system of the nation. So that's how we encapsulated at a very simple level the distinction. We started by doing this service throughout those countries, 7 countries of enterprises, to try to understand the magnitude of the problem. And in fact, it was very interesting. It's not as if it was a uniform extent of state capture across the whole region. There was a clear distinction between the Russia, the Ukraine, and the Azerbaijan, very high level capture versus countries that were moving to market and competition both in the polity and in the economy, like the Baltics. Hungary was doing well at the time. Now there's been a reversal, and so on. We were, in terms of trying to capture the notion of capture empirically, we were asking questions about the illicit purchase of parliamentary legislation, of decrees, of central bank influence, but also in a number of other dimensions. Now, again, does it matter? We found that it mattered enormously. The firms, the respondent firms that were living in a more market-driven environment and not captured were growing at twice the pace than those that were in a high capture country themselves, in terms of also the revenue flows, in terms of their investments, was much higher in countries that were not subject to capture. That's at the micro level with this microeconomic data. That was very clear impact. We saw earlier the more aggregate impact. We try to understand what comes out, at least from this part of the world, as key important determinants of what distinguishes factors that distinguish countries that were subject to capture versus those that were less so, that they managed to avoid it. And two key dimensions came out very clear from both around contestability or competition. The extent of political competition, political contestability, and civil liberties in the country. So the fact that there was a vibrant competition among political parties, there was voice to the citizens, to NGOs, civil liberties, and so those countries did well, did much better in the transition versus those that did not have. As important was on the economic reality. There were basically some safeguards that allowed for more open competition in the economy and therefore medium, smaller scale enterprises and others. Also openness to foreign investors and so on was there. So essentially already provided at a very broad level two of the key dimensions to start looking at it in order to ensure the extent to which anti-monopoly legislation not only was put in place but effectively implemented was very important and so on. After this work for the economics of transition, in collaboration with the World Economic Forum, which has its own survey, I managed to insert some questions to try to capture this issue of state capture. For a couple of years, they allowed me, once it was realized that it was very politically sensitive, they said, thank you very much. But at least in the mid-2000s, I had the access to these, and I could look at the data. What we see here on the left-hand side, it's just for some groups around the world, the extent to which the firms themselves were reporting that bribery was taking place to obtain certain permits and so on. So very much in the context of administrative bribery. And it would not surprise you, it was not that high, but still in the United States around the 20% realm, while in the Nordic countries was almost non-existent, 4 or 5% were reporting the relatives. Watch what happens when we put state capture in it. We have to change the scale of the whole realm and what happened in particular United States. This is 2004. So United States, the real issue was not so much an administrative level, but what was happening regarding the higher level in terms of state capture. At the time, we're talking 2000, when I presented in different fora in the US, I was presenting in 2005. I was heavily criticized in terms of shooting at the messenger. The data must be wrong. We don't have that problem. By 2008, the Wall Street crisis ensues, and there's a deeper understanding of how basically the financial regulations have been captured by those interests and so on. That was not criticized any longer, and it becomes important. We'll discuss, I hope, a bit more during the Q&A these issues. I know how much this has been in the public discourse. So before concluding, let me just show, to put it on the table for discussion, the importance of looking at sectors on this. So far, this has been for nationwide, economy-wide type of issues that are discussed, the corruption, governance, or state capture. But it's very important, that in that context, to go and look at the sector. In different countries, there are going to be different dimensions which are incredibly important, whether it's the financial sector or what happens in resource-dependent countries, as I suggested, and that's one of the areas we studied, is incredibly important regarding capture as well. And unfortunately, that's why we focus so much on that. Those countries perform much more poorly in terms of governance on average. There are exceptions, obviously, the Norways, so the Chiles, and there are other exceptions that prove that yes, it can be done, it can be resource-rich and not subject to the resource course. But overall, the levels, as we see here, are much lower than countries that are not blessed, of course, with natural resources. Not only that, but the direction of travel over time has been in opposite direction. Not very markedly, but it's not trivial either. One has to sit back and ponder, what have we gotten wrong? We've been working on this, so we're trying to draw a lesson. Why? Because of the boom, perhaps, or in spite of the big boom in terms of natural resources, countries did not see that opportunity to improve governance. To the contrary, and capture is very prevalent today. In fact, this is the same graph I showed earlier in terms of the big dividend, the tripling of income per capita for the world. If one unpacks it for resource-rich countries versus non-resource-rich countries, the old popular notion, popular by some in the old guard, who's always done, Mr. Kaufmann, you worry so much about governance and corruption. That's a luxury good. We'll get there. We just discovered, our country discovered oil. That will replace governance for a while. And over time, we will improve, and it doesn't work that way. The differences are even more marked in resource-rich countries between those that have it. So it has even a magnifying effect rather than an attenuating effect. We measure the 80-plus resource-relevant countries in the world for a very specialized assessment of that. That's also on the web. It's called the Resource Governance Index. That's very different than the worldwide governance indicator, which I explained in detail, and anybody who's interested is in the web, and we can discuss it more. But it's very important also there to measure, and it goes very much, is the way of saying, trust me, it goes into the details, basically, dimension by dimension, whether this is for the world, I mean the 80-plus countries, this is for one particular country, and once it's green and red. This is to illustrate that we, in spite of the way I have presented today, we ought not get stuck at the overly aggregate level. That was for presentation purposes. One is really interested in progress, and there are reformists here to work with those decision makers when there's no escape in getting into the diagnostic details of what's working, what's not. Every country, even those that have the most significant challenges in red, whether it's in resource governance or in overall governance and state capture, there are islands of sanity, islands of transparency, islands of leadership that are doing well. Central banks, in many countries, they're doing very, very well, even though many other institutions are not. So one has to get at the very detailed micro diagnostic institution level, which only the experts in the country can do best. We can provide some tools and so on, which we have done in many countries, and help with the data. But there's no escape of getting to the very disaggregated level. Just wanted to mention before the conclusion slide, is not doing full justice. That is a very important dimension that we haven't discussed. It's international environment, the international dimension. So I know how committed and how important for you is what's happening in South Africa and the state capture and the Commission of Inquiry and what the fantastic work that Haroon and your colleagues have done with a big report and book and the follow-ups. So that's very domestically driven, very important, because ultimately what matters most is what the country, its leadership, not only in the executive but everywhere, decides what to do. But the international environment matters very much. Multinational, it's a divide nowadays. There are those that are operating in a form that unfortunately abets bad governance and state capture, and even engages with state capture. What other examples than other in Brazil, vis-a-vis many other Latin American countries, and even the way involved some of the countries in Southern Africa, but also in the oil, gas, and mining. There are some that in particular, some of the commodity traders are not exercising the best forms of government. In contrast with some who have moved to a completely different approach and trajectory where it pays for them and it comes from the leadership to engage in good governance, and that can help, in fact, in the country. Increasingly, some of the big mining countries have recognized that they have to engage with the communities, and it's going to be embedded in the country for 25 years. They don't want their investments being in question. So it pays into the government. The oil industry has been a bit slower, but there are some of them, particularly in Europe, are embracing them. Not so some in the United States like Exxon and Chevron that are still fighting transparency movements. So it's very, very mixed, but then knowing very well that environment and with whom to collaborate and whom to make accountable is important. And then there are international initiatives like against the illicit financial flows, mandatory reporting on companies that started with the Dodd-Frank, stalled because of political reasons in the US, but the EU has totally, and Canada has totally moved forward. And then there's the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. I happen to sit on the global board, so I'm biased, but I think these type of initiatives of basically promoting and committing to global norms can make a very important difference for the reformers within a country that want to support course, subscribing for these norms of transparency, ethics, disclosure, accountability in that sector. Just an example, in fact, I mentioned it in concluding that to go from the general to the concrete. Let me just conclude now so that I'm very much looking forward to a more interactive part. So we went through the importance of evidence-based data power at all kinds of levels. We discussed the notion, the issues around state capture, which is a different lens and approach to view corruption and misgovernance, which is extremely costly. But I think not mentioned, one huge difference between administrative corruption that we were always accustomed to look at. If I've been drinking and driving, and I got my license taken away, and if I were to pay a bribe to get my license back, that's not good. That doesn't help. And one can measure the cost and the cost of the bribe and so on. That act in itself, or if I get the driver's license 6 months earlier than I should, may have at the margin of consequences to somebody else if I commit an accident and so on. But it doesn't have a lasting society-wide impact. And that's what happened with state capture, is that by shaping the rules of the game to the benefits of the few is at the expense of everybody at that very moment. It is at the expense of the public good, at the expense of rules of the game that in a society should be set to benefit every citizen. In economics, we call it externality. The externality of misdeeds related to state capture are multiple, are orders of magnitude. It's a difference of kind. It's not a difference of degree with administrative corruption. So administrative corruption, also petty corruption, is very insidious, and it should be passive, and it should not be there. But it does not have that enormous multiplier effect because it affects so vastly everybody else. And secondly, in a place where it's state capture, the legitimacy in the eyes of everybody else, law-level civil servants, the citizens themselves, the legitimacy of the institutions suffer so much that it affects even further petty corruption and administrative corruption, but it cannot be totally linked, they said implicitly. But that's something to be kept in mind. These matters could sowed enormously for growth, macro, social, democratic institutions, the political. To address it, that was what was not sufficiently recognized, particularly in the more official dome of international fora, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. Everybody was focused on the supply side of governance. How public sector reforms, how do we bring more computerization? Civil service reform is very important, but that was the focus, the supply side. Insufficient focus on how important the demand side was to tackle these issues. Those are what makes of voice and democratic accountability, the role of civil society, key leaders in think tanks, NGOs, in the media. And for that, of course, transparency is an absolutely key instrument, as well as the new innovations in open data. Chile is an emblematic case of what has been done in recent years with civil society pressure. We can discuss that more. In governance in extractives, we discussed it that it's a major challenge. So it's international dimension. It's a challenge, but also an opportunity. The EITIs of this world, the multinationals that are behaving better, and so on. And then, before concluding, the last point is that there are very interesting innovations taking place as reform entry points that one ought not disregard in this area. And of course, every country, South Africa, you're the expert, I'm not, would know what makes more sense or not. In transparency, of course, this whole movement towards much more disclosure and transparency in general, and it's not only driven from the government, from others, but in extractive, for instance, we talk about the key troika that we have pushed very much for EITI and the 50+ countries that belong to EITI. we still hope that South Africa can join soon, subscribe to that about all payments of multinationals to government regarding extractive should be totally transparent. Totally transparent disclosure of contracts, still work in progress, but it's absolutely critical. And as important in that choice, so that's the how much, that's the revenue. The what are the countries, but the as important is the who, and the whole movement. And this is very, very innovative that has happened only the past few years towards beneficiary owner disclosure, that and not only in extractive, but we use extractive at the point of entry now. It's progressing in many countries of everybody has a right to own, and there have to be a public registry about who are the true owners and beneficiary owners of companies. That helps enormously to see whether there are politically exposed people, the holdings of, and if one looks at these 3 pieces of data, untangling potential ways where capture may have taken place is it's incredibly important. I said so. That's BO, transparency. BO. What's PB? PB is another great innovation. We see the case of Brazil, and right now playing out enormously in the U.S. Pre-bargaining. So all kinds of tools to make these disclosures at the deepest level happen. The one that has committed the crime may know so much about how the whole mechanism functions. That's happening. And then let me end this about the importance of seizing, and that's an observation from so many other places, seizing when there is an historical opportunity for change and reform, and of course only the people in the country know when that opportunity is had, and those opportunities do go away if they are not seized. And I can tell later the case of Chile during the discussion that is right. Thank you.
So I should have just very briefly mentioned in the introduction that Daniel's here because he presented at the Zondo Commission. And we were actually treated to the master class. So the Zondo Commission got a reduced form version. I'm going to open for questions. Daniel's only request is that you identify yourself before asking the question, and we'll take maybe batches of 3 or 4 at a time. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, Anthony over there. So we've got 3 to start with. And Vicky, 4. Yeah.
Thank you. Gary Pinard from the Democracy, Governance and Service Delivery Program at the Human Sciences Research Council. I have just a question for clarification and many questions. The question for clarification, I think I heard you say, Dr. Kaufmann, that effective anti-monopoly legislation is a key factor in combating state corruption. I just wanted to check that. And then to ask, and to apologize for my ignorance about the World Governance Index, does it include assessing the quality of governance inside political parties and whether there is an impact or correlation there?
Good morning. My name is Daniel Page. I run a fossil-free energy campaign on fossil-free South Africa. I'm interested to know, many questions, but myself too. I'm interested to know if there are any links between inequality and corruption. And secondly, you've talked about the extractive industries in general, but I wondered if you had any particular observations about the fossil fuel industries in particular.
I'm trying to organize Daniel a piece of paper. Do you realize he's right?
Yeah. This governance I'm using an app.
Anthony?
Anthony Black from the School of Economics.
What was it? I didn't hear your name.
Anthony Black, I'm from the School of Economics. You mentioned the EITI and that you were hoping that science would join. So I just wanted to, I think that there's been some reluctance I wanted to get into the science. Just add a second, very different question. The position of China, could you pick up China on your there, but that's a country with obviously limited transparency and accountability, but very, very high growth. Absolutely discounted from that was unusual consideration.
Okay, and then with Vicky.
Yes, Vicky Robinson in the financial crime space. I'm interested in, although my focus is corruption, I'm interested in the voice of accountability indicator, because I think increasingly there's a debate in South Africa about our electoral system and how that impacts ultimately on
What kind of system?
the electoral system.
Oh, electoral, yeah.
And ultimately how that translates into our voices as South Africans to impact at a material level what happens at a government level. I'm interested in trends you might have seen elsewhere where you've seen a change into the green versus a change into the red internationally, where if there be a fundamental electoral system shifts that have impacts on the change in the market, or where there's more subtle lines.
Julian.
Yeah, you want to take one more? Or?
You're
Okay, maybe take one more. Tessa?
Tessa Minter from the College of Accounting. Do you investigate to any extent the alleged capture by the big four accounting firms of business and the regulatory agencies?
Sorry, so what about the accounting firm? What about the
There's a book that's just been released called The Bean Counters by
Right.
Richard Brooks, who's the financial giant in the UK.
Right.
And the allegations of the capture by the profession of the business world and of the regulatory agencies. So it's sort of being shepherd and butcher.
Right.
At the
So
same time.
that I got. But what is your question to me?
Is that part of any of your investigation
Okay.
that you do for accountability?
Right. Okay. Good. We have until midnight? I mean, it's just to prepare these very important comments and questions. Let me start with point of transmission. I mean, just the fact that I'm here with you and that I've been asked to give a presentation doesn't mean I have the answer. And we are all students in this. You know, the best definition, as far as I'm concerned, of the notion of an expert or a consultant was given by Mark Twain over 100 years ago. You know what he said? Whether expert is somebody from out of town. So that's the notion that. So these are incredibly important questions, and it's a work in progress. And even though what we say and what we have learned and so on, I hope you invite me again, and maybe in 5-10 years this will be different. I mean, this is evolving. This is not the social sciences. It's not the hard sciences, and that's how we will learn as we go. And there's still many unanswered questions. But part of that, related to that, so much, and Haroon and your colleagues know it better than everybody, and that's why it's so important the work that you have all done. It's so context specific. So I'm going to answer. That doesn't necessarily mean this applies exactly like that here. And that's why I case studies like Chile, Brazil, and so on may be relevant, but it's up to you to figure out what is particularly relevant here. And that relates to one of the questions in terms of do we look at this or not. At the end of the day, if one is going to think through, okay, what do we do here? There is no escape of having an in-country, in-depth, empirically based diagnosis. And there are different tools for that and different approaches, and you have the book and others. And we have been engaged in some in the past, whether now also on extractives, in the past governance more related. Out of that, and I have hundreds of slides of that, which I'm not going to bother, comes out, if we look at the map internally of Ecuador, of all the organizations, which ones are captured, corrupt, not corrupt, and so on, even versus Peru, will be very different. So there's no escape of doing that. That goes to the issue of the regulatory capture of particular type of industry. Certainly will vary from one country to another. Unfortunately, there are some generalities, and yes, the customs tend to be an organization that tends to be very challenged. Central banks tend to operate much better for a variety of reasons, and one can learn with those, but it's not universal, and one has to do that more. Let me start then with your question about effective monopoly. That's incredibly important, and let me give you an example. In the case of Chile, that has been regarded, we have gone to a commission, which is very different from it here. It was not judicial nature, but to indicate what are the reforms after a couple of corruption scandals, one very much related to state capture through political campaign finance. And absolute key it has been all the strengthening and implementation, effective implementation of anti-monopoly legislation. Now, Chile is a country with one notable exception, which is the largest mining company in the world, which is state-owned enterprise, Codelco, which is managed extremely well and comes out rated in one of the institutes at the top of the world, even above Statoil in Norway and so on. But otherwise, it's a country that has undergone massive privatization, and basically all the enterprise sector is in the hands of the private sector. In those type of settings, then anti-monopoly becomes very important. In a country which has more mix is also very important, but also there's no escape in having very serious look at state-owned enterprises and what needs to be done for those to be reformed. Regarding political parties, that's an excellent question, and that if you know about an index covering the world or part of the world which is followed on time about the internal democratic and functioning of political parties, which my observation on our studies are just really important. We would integrate to the worldwide governance indicators, but we don't, so it's not fully there. But the extent to which there is well-functioning selection of the leadership and so on, it's very important. That's one of the, it would be interesting, if you're interested in that issue, to look at the recent major reforms in Chile regarding our membership. Our membership has become much more democratic, and the election and selection of their leaders, which is the case. And there, let me link that before I go to the next question. We were discussing that last night. When a historical opportunity for change and reform happens, the case of Chile. Okay, the scandals take place. We're talking about 2 years ago. Then it is a commission and so on. Much of the parliament, the last thing they wanted was to adopt these reforms because it would go totally against their interest in terms of political finance. They would stop getting, because it was much more, it would have been much more regimented and so on. All these issues of not having lobby and not having more restrictions on lobby and so on, that benefited them. So many of these reforms, the whole issue of democratizing the whole political parties and systems, they went against it. However, civil society gets organized. The commission issues their report and elections, legislative elections for the Congress were coming up. Civil society gets mobilized, the media gets mobilized, and they were put on notice, well, either you go for it or that you're going to be voted out, essentially. And at first there were 6 or 7 that were reform-minded enough. I said, okay, let's go for it. The others had no choice. At any other point, 4 years ago, before any scandal, there was no that important. There would have been no competition. That I've observed in other countries of the world. So the issue of the political moment of opportunity for those type of actions is critical. Inequality and corruption, I did not do full justice by not discussing these absolutely. And it's another, and there are studies demonstrating that when corruption increases, in higher corruption countries, inequality is much higher, including by the International Monetary Fund researchers. So the data is there, and that's absolutely the case, which is of significant concern in places that have the threat or the reality of state capture, because it becomes a vicious circle, whereas state capture is essentially happens because of enormous inequality of political influence. I mean, and that already enables a process by which those have much more influence in the political process, they are economically powerful. That affects even further inequality in the political and economic sphere that strengthens that. So the process of inequality further disempowers the rest of the citizens and the population, the middle class, the poor, and further entrenches on extracting, unbundling oil and gas, the fossils in particular, versus the mining. And that's all in the report, by the way. We have resource governance index report, the 80 countries, and we have it distinguished by countries that are particularly rich on one versus the other, and what kind of differences emerge. Interesting enough, contrary to a prior, we expected there would be much worse governance in the sector, in the oil, than in the mining, but it's much more complicated and varied than that. Both are all over the place. The oil industry, two things, has been more reticent and, as I said, slower in embracing reforms and transparency initiative. There are a variety. There's a cultural aspect about oil men. They are men, and they are very insulated in the 76th floor in Houston, typically, and so on. And they don't feel that they have to interact too much with the rest. So much is offshore. In the mining industry, they have come to the realization they're totally embedded with the population and the communities, and it's not going to be sustainable. And they get to know much now. They get to know the reality on the ground. So much better. So they have evolved faster in terms of realizing we're in a different era, we have totally different. But within them, both, they are significant different. The other different in terms of the consequences. For fossil industry, we have to be particularly mindful nowadays because of the impact of climate change. And that's something we study. While on the mining side, it's on the environmental, particularly water. It's an incredibly costly and things like that. So in terms of the externalities of each industry, they're major difference. They're both depletable resources, so they share things in common on how to approach the whole value chain from exploration to extraction to sell, and that's why there are many things in common, but there are important differences that I just mentioned. Okay, EITI. EITI, why not? In South Africa, I was going to ask you. You would know. I can only tell you that I don't have inside knowledge of every country that has not joined. I know a little bit about my own country has yet to join, and hopefully will join. Let's face it. You tell me whether there is some similarity here, and we are also at the very, very south of the continent of Chile, and we've been quite arrogant in Chile. We feel, and in the early days, many in the Chilean government, why do we need to join this initiative? This is for poorer developing countries in any case. We in Chile are much more interested. We want to be great members of OECD. We joined OECD, and so that's what really matters. Why should we be quote unquote in bed with the Middle African countries that were joining forces? There was a very patronizing type of element at first. That's been changing over time because now they know with the UK, many European countries have joined, but Brazil has had that too. But increasingly the world is changing, and now because of the scandals in the countries, well, maybe there are some things to be added to that, and because now we're not talking about the initial 15 countries, there are 50 of us that embrace that. You would know better if there are other particular countries. In Chile, there was a concern by the Minister of Finance that as part of the disclosure of all these payments, it would be fully disclosed how much stays in the center versus how much goes to the locality. Chile is a very centralized country, but all the copper is in the north. So there was a bit of concern about the pressure that might come to distribute much more to the producing regions, which happen in China. Yeah, that would require, we should all be together at midnight. But the only comment I'll make without doing full justice to the issue is China, of course, is a unique case and has been incredibly successful in so many dimensions. And often I get the question, but here there, you write it so lowly, the work of governance for that government, and they reject their performance so well in so many dimensions. Well, if one looks carefully at the picture of China, which I didn't show the slide, it's extremely mixed. Well, yes, voice and accountability is a major challenge, which is the second, but the other dimension, particularly government effectiveness, the improvement over time and where they are now, they are an example to the rest of the American world. And also in regulatory environment and other areas of the country, that's why it's so important to get into the specifics in unbundling different dimensions of governance has made major progress on some and not on some analysts, and I'm not going to go there, I'm not an expert in China, say they look at our data for that, make analysis, and they say basically, if the next stage, if they're going to have a real kick in the next 20, 30 years, they have to look at the areas where they're weaker. They have already improved enormously, so that major challenge they have, of course, accountability, want to be a drag, and the other ones control corruption. They're very, very concerned. They're very serious. Unfortunately, they think that they can get rid of it by decree and by putting in jail or even sentencing to death a few people rather than enabling more accountability. That's not what we do. So anyway, it's very complicated, and it's not the case that it's a uniform full governance performance in thanks to particular dimension. Vicky on electoral system. In terms of the worldwide governance indicators, if that's the question, whether that encompasses fully the data, the answer is no, because we can only rely on outside data of any source that rates the world, or at least a good part of the world. We can deal with some gaps, and which is periodically done. And this is a very type of in-depth, sophisticated research where they don't, that's not followed. So that whether they have this Freedom House type of data that would show whether they have a functional electoral system or a not functional democratic versus not, and they rated it, yes, but we use that type of data. But when one gets into the much more unbundled and nuanced different ways that an electoral system could be functioning better or not, we do not have that empirical data to do that. And as an analyst myself, that's not one of my areas of expertise. So I've not looked at, but there are political scientists that have looked into the issue, but without necessarily being able to further.